So my parents are actually watching this on live stream right now, and so I want to take this opportunity to say hi to them. Hi, Mom and Dad. But that's amazing, that I can do that. And that now in the 21st century, even though they're 5,000 miles away in Colorado and it's 7 a.m. for them, I can communicate with them like that. And as time goes on, we've been given more and more ways to communicate with one another. And what people have seen today, or what people have talked about so far, is all the wonderful things that that can do for us as a species, as a race, as people, as communities. And that's wonderful. But it's also generated a lot of fear. And the fear is around the fact that as we communicate more and more with each other through technology, that we're losing the humanity of our communication. And I love this quote because I feel like it symbolizes so wonderfully all of the fear that's out there that I've encountered over and over again in my research about what technology is doing to us as human communicators. But here's how I summarize the fear. We're all going to become technology hermits. And we're going to live in our technology hermit caves, beaming out messages to other technology hermit caves, as our ability to communicate with each other in person slowly withers into nothingness. Because the theme of today is unconventional wisdom, I'm going to share a little bit of the conventional wisdom that I've encountered around technology and communication. And the first bit is the assumption that the way we communicated in the past is the best way of communicating. And you actually hear this all the time. People will say, well, back in my day, we did it this way, or kids these days are doing this. And the assumption that underlies that is really that the way that it was done in the past was better, and the way we're doing it now is wrong. And second of all, there's the assumption that technology is somehow fundamentally changing the way that we communicate, that our underlying system of communication is being permanently altered by the introduction of communication through technology. So here's my unconventional wisdom for you. First of all, even though we are communicating more and more using technology, I think this is making in-person communication better. And second, I think that technology is making human communication look a lot different. If you think about it, the way that communication looks now is much, much different than it looked even 10 years ago. But I don't think that's changing anything fundamental about the nature of human communication. So to start to get at this, I ran a little experiment. This is my friend Michelle. Michelle is really annoyed at me because I've just stopped by her room and interrupted her work to ask if she wants to have coffee in 2 days' time. And I've done this in person because we used to communicate in person all the time, right? That was better. It was better back then, before we had all this technology to do things like schedule coffee. I mean, of course, that's a little bit ridiculous. There are some things that are actually legitimately done better using technology, like scheduling coffee. Because if you think about it, communicating in person has a lot of extra burden. You're having to process all sorts of things, like someone's facial expression and their tone of voice, their gesticulation. And that's a lot of extra brain power you could be using to do something like, say, preparing your upcoming TED Talk. So, how do we know when it's good to communicate in person and not? And to answer this, I'm going to turn to the study of linguistics. In the 1970s, there was a very famous linguist named Paul Grice who was studying how people communicate effectively and efficiently. And he came up with these maxims, or principles, to describe how people had effective and efficient communication. And the maxims, or his maxim of quantity, is first of all that you should make your contribution to the conversation as informative as is required. So basically, give someone enough information that they know what you're talking about. But second, don't make your contribution more informative than is required. So don't go on and on about stuff that doesn't matter. And don't give someone too much information. And when Paul Grice was writing, we didn't have all the technology to communicate that we had now. We had the telephone and letters and talking in person, and that was pretty much it. But today, when we have so many options for how we're communicating with one another, we really have to take into account the second part of this maxim, that by communicating in person, we can give someone too much information. All of that extra information can actually start to take away from the message that you're giving in certain situations. So what does this mean for communication more generally? This means that because of technology, we can now start to optimize our in-person communication. It means that we can use our very limited in-person time more optimally. And what this really does is, because we can use technology for things like information transfer, for those communications that don't benefit from the body language and the facial expressions and the gesticulation, this enriches our in-person communication because we're using it how we want to use it, and for those communications that do really benefit from in-person contact. And that's really valuable. But of course, face-to-face communication is not all fun and games. There are things that are really, really difficult about it. And learning to communicate face-to-face is something that we have to learn to do over our entire lives. And another concern, and not to harp on Sherry Turkle, but she has some beautiful quotes, so I'm using another one. Another concern is that because we can use technology perhaps to get out of doing things that are difficult, that we will somehow become weaker communicators, that we will stop being able to communicate as effectively and will turn more and more to technology. And this is where I want to talk about social learning. We're not born with social skills. Social skills are something that we acquire over the course of our entire lives, largely by trial and error. And by being in a new situation or a new context, we can have to acquire a whole new set of social skills. For example, 2 years ago I went to Japan, and my social skills there were not up to snuff. I made a lot of mistakes when I first went to Japan socially, but I learned over the course of the month I was there how to have social skills in Japan. And learning to use a new piece of technology for communication is somewhat like going to a new culture. Learning to have social skills through technology is a process that takes time. And so it's not necessarily fair to look at the first way that someone uses a piece of technology and then generalize that. So for example, before I went to university, I got Facebook. And I was so excited that I friended every member of my incoming university class on Facebook. And then I got there. And some of them were really awesome when I started meeting them in person, and we're still friends. Some of them were not quite as awesome in person as I had been led to believe they would be online, but I learned from that experience. So before I came to Cambridge, instead of friending everyone on Facebook, I didn't friend anyone. And then instead, I used Facebook to maintain my existing network of friends and to do things like schedule hanging out in person. But you couldn't just look at the first thing I did with Facebook and when I got it and assume that that's how I was going to keep using it. It was a social skill that I had to learn to acquire over a period of several years. And when we look at technology more generally, as things change, we have to look at the entire process that people go through learning social skills with technology. We can't just look at the first thing that people do. But what about this fundamental change? If there really was this fundamental change going on in how people were communicating as humans, we would expect to see it first in children, in the children that are growing up using modern communications technology. And this is the prediction, that children are communicating differently now because they have technology. Last year, I was part of a research team working on an international project looking at how modern communications technologies were affecting people around the world. And one of the first things we asked our over 5,000 participants was, pick your favorite. What's your preferred method of communication? And this is data from the UK. In the UK, 65% of people said we prefer to communicate face-to-face. And then we split it up by age group and didn't find this huge split at all. People who grew up using technology don't really prefer to communicate face-to-face any more or any less than people who didn't grow up using things like the internet or text messaging. So to some people, that would be surprising. But we also asked, okay, how do they react to technology? So we asked people, if you had a really important message to convey, how would you want to convey it? How trustworthy do you find different methods of technology? So here's the data for text messaging, and it turns out that kids who've grown up using text messaging understand its limitations. They understand that it's not necessarily the most trustworthy method of communication for a really important message. But for information transfer, it's fine, and they understand that just as well, or potentially more so than adults who didn't have text messaging until a few years ago in their lives. But I think most strikingly, we asked them how trustworthy they felt face-to-face communication to be, and they found it to be just as trustworthy as adults found it to be. They understand the richness of face-to-face communication. They understand its trustworthiness. They understand that for an important message, in-person communication is by far the most trustworthy method of doing that. And this is powerful because there's this prediction that kids who are growing up with technology are not understanding something fundamental about human communication and that they're being changed by growing up with technology. And we're not finding that to be the case. In fact, the opposite is true. They're not changing as human communicators. Just the methods they're using to communicate are different. So I'll leave you with this point. This is a really famous love letter. How do I love these? Let me count the ways. And it's an example of written communication of some very powerful emotions. This is a love letter. And yet, we revere it now as one of the great examples of human communication, even though it's written. Because even some very heavy emotional topics don't necessarily benefit from in-person communication. Some things are better expressed in writing. And as we continue, as technology continues to change, we have to focus not on what the technology looks like, but what's actually going on inside. Because even though the way that we're writing and the methods we're using to write are changing, this doesn't mean that we're changing as human communicators. And as technology continues to change, really think about what's changing and what's staying the same. And I think you'll find things aren't changing nearly as much as we might think. Thank you.